purple out here today. Thought that purple was inspiring me. I was tempted to come out on stage, and just kind of do one of those Ray Lewis things. But I'm going to leave that to Ray Lewis this afternoon for coming out of the tunnel. You don't want to see me do it. Might rip something up here. All right. So this week we're entering the new year, and how many people have walked down the self-help book aisle at Barnes & Noble or looked online at the self-help section? Have you ever been there and how many people have read a self-help book within the past couple of years? Probably. I've read one that I thought was pretty good. Well, I looked at what are the top titles of self-help books, self-improvement books this year. So I want to share some titles with you this morning. I want you to pay attention to what they promise, to what they're saying. The titles are promising us something, and they title them this way because the marketing people said, hey, we want you to buy the book, and so they title them. But here are some titles of some of the top ones for this year. Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, How to Finally Really Grow Up. I've been trying to do that for years, and now there's a book that'll tell me how to grow up. That'll be great. The next one I thought was interesting. It's called The Secret. Like there's a secret to this life, that they're going to reveal in this book. The next one's called The One Decision. Make the single choice that will lead to a life of more. How do we get more stuff? How do we get more? And it's just one thing. There's a secret formula. There's a magic formula out there that's going to help us to get what we want out of life. Next one, similar idea. You get one shot at life. Aim for success. Secrets of living a meaningful life. And so here's that. There's that one shot, that one thing. I like this next title just because I thought it was an interesting title, but it was on the top list. It said, "Excuse me, your life is waiting." I thought, yeah, that's a good title. I'd pick that one up. Now, the next one, was in the self-help list. And I know you're not going to believe it, but this was a new title that came out this year, and I don't know where it's coming from. I do know where it's coming from, but here's the title of it. How to Survive a Robot Uprising. Zombie apocalypse is coming, all these things. And so, but I thought, what in the world? Well, I won't even go into all that. All right. And then the last one is actually my favorite title, Faking It. How to Seem Like a Better Person Without Actually Improving Yourself. That was the best one yet, because that's the most honest title, isn't it? I mean, that's the most authentic title. It's interesting how that's so honest at the same time so wrong. That's what it was. But you notice that one thing that many of these things have in common is they promise the one thing, the one secret to success, the one secret formula. Like there's some magic formula out there that the rest of us don't know that's going to improve our life or make our life better. I got some bad news, folks. There's no one thing. There's no magic formula. There's no secret. I find that most of life is about hard work, dedication, commitment, persistence, endurance, strength. And I do believe that all of our life does hinge on one thing. And we'll talk about that this morning. Now, I did read a self-help book back in the 80s, and it was written by a man named the late Stephen Covey. Did anybody here read the book Seven Habits of Highly Effective People? Do you remember that book? How many people have read that book? A lot of us, right? I'm amazed at how I talk to people even today, and a lot of the language from that book is still used in our society, and in our workplaces, in our homes today. One of the things that he's well known for is his time management matrix. And he actually talked about in his book how it's not about time management, it's actually about self-management, how we manage ourselves. And he broke time management out into 4 quadrants. Do you remember the 4 quadrants? The quadrants were, you got urgent and non-urgent, important and not important. And he said, we spend a lot of our time, mostly probably here in the Northeast, in quadrant 1. All the crisis, the pressing issues, the deadlines, the meetings. And so these are all things that present themselves as urgent and important, and so we pay a lot of attention and we invest a lot of time in those things. Then if you look at quadrant 2, you'll see that there are things here in quadrant 2 that are not as pressing or urgent, but they're very important in life. They're preparation, planning, prevention, relationship building, and personal development, as well as recreation is also a part of that. Getting healthy, physically fit can be a part of that. It's not that urgent, but it's very important for us to do those things. Now, quadrant 3 is the place we might find ourselves sometimes thinking these things are are urgent, but they're not really important, but we sometimes think they are. Interruptions, some mail, email, texting, Facebook, those types of things, many popular activities. For example, how many people have been talking to someone and they answer the phone while you're talking to them? They pick up the phone, answer the phone while you're actually talking to them. They get interrupted, right? And so they put whatever you're right before them on hold, and they pay attention to that phone call. They don't even know, you and I don't even know what the person on the other end of the line wants. It's about their agenda and what they expect of us, not about what's important to us. It may be something very trivial, but we don't know that. We just pick up the phone. That's how interruptions happen. And so it may not be anything of importance, but we pick it up because we think it might be important, right? And we think it might be urgent, so we pick up the phone. The other thing, and then quadrant 4 are the things, the trivial pursuits, some phone calls, like we mentioned, excessive TV, video games, all those things, the time wasters in our life, the escape things that we do in our lives. Now, for those of you who read the book, where does Covey say we need to spend more of our time? What quadrant? 2, right. We need more time in quadrant 2. What happens, though, is when you're responsible and conscientious, which a lot of us are, in quadrant 1, what happens to quadrant 1 when you're a responsible and conscientious person? It grows, right? Because you're responsible and conscientious. And so you get more responsibility, which makes you even more conscientious, and so it grows. So there are more deadlines, more crises, more things that need to be fixed, more problems that need to be handled, more meetings to go to, and so this just grows. And what happens if that grows out of proportion, out of balance in our lives, we then start gravitating to quadrant 4 to escape that. And so then we end up wasting a lot of time and spinning our wheels on a lot of things because we've moved over in quadrant 4. The other thing that happens is quadrant 3 people are thinking they're in quadrant 1. Everything's urgent, everything's immediate. So they're handling everything, thinking it's important when not everything that we do is important. But we think we're doing important stuff. So it's busy where we're just kind of going through the motions. We don't even realize it. We're in quadrant 3. And so we can make that mistake. And what shrinks in all of this? Quadrant 2. The place we're supposed to be spending more time is actually the smallest in our lives. Let me ask you another question. What quadrant do you think God is in? Your relationship with God, where does it fall in Stephen Covey's idea or paradigm here? Where does your relationship with God fall? It's 2, right? See how easy it is to allow our relationship to God to be something on the back burner of our lives? Because we're focused so much on what we think is important and urgent or not important and urgent that we can lose track of God. We can actually drift from God. And that can happen. Notice the wise men that we're celebrating today. What did they do? They were probably pretty important people in their society, in their time. And they left their daily life. They left quadrant 1 stuff. All their deadlines, their meetings, anything that they had on their agenda. They put all that life on hold and made a journey to Bethlehem to worship the King. They said, I'm going to put quadrant 1 stuff on hold so I can go spend time worshiping the King. Quadrant 2. They were wise men, right? Wise enough to know they needed to do that. And that's what part of their wisdom was. Jesus also taught a lot of wisdom when he was here. Jesus taught us, actually in Luke chapter 10, verse 27, he says this, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself." He talked about this as the greatest commandment. Love God with everything you have. Put your love of God, make it the most important thing in your life. That's what he said. He also taught in the Sermon on the Mount, which we read from today, which we heard in the gospel lesson. He talked about not worrying about your clothing or what you're going to eat or what's going to happen to your body, which I interpreted as, don't go on a diet, Matt. That's how I interpret it, Not what Jesus meant at all, but it's funny how we can reinterpret the Bible like that, isn't it? So, but he was saying, but at the end of that, he's saying, don't worry about all these things, these quadrant 1 things. He said, strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness. He said, put God's kingdom first in your life. He said, make it the number one priority of your life. Make that what life is all about. And that brings us to Revelation. We heard from Revelation today, and John was on Patmos in exile on the island. He was writing to the churches in Asia, and he wrote a letter to them, and that's what we get the book of Revelation that we have in our Bibles. And he wrote this letter to be circulated among these 7 churches, and the first church that the letter was sent to was the church in Ephesus. And that's what we heard this morning, the letter to Ephesus. And he says to them, basically, you guys are doing a great job. You guys are doing some really good things as a church and doing wonderful things and doing good works and checking out false apostles, and you're doing lots of good things. But, it's always that but in there. He said, you've lost your first love. It's interesting that he puts this in relationship terms. You've lost your first love. Remember Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God and love God with all heart, mind, and soul, and strength. And John kind of puts these two concepts together and says, you've lost your first love. Now, it's easy to do and not even know we're doing it. I've, met, obviously I've mentioned before, I meet with some couples, and I've had couples say to me over the years of ministry, they've come to me and they say, I feel like we don't love each other anymore. They've been married for 20, 30 years, and they feel like they're married to a stranger. What they're describing is their feeling of not being connected to this person anymore, and what's happened is what's called relational drift. You get busy living life and raising kids and running here and there, and then all of a sudden you wake up one day and they realize that they've drifted so far apart that they don't even realize who they're married to anymore. This happens. This is not like anybody's fault. It's what's called relational drift. We just drift away slowly, daily, weekly, yearly, and then we wake up one day and go, we're strangers. Even though once we had a first love. We were in love, deeply in love at one point in our relationship, but somehow we lost that first love because what happened was life got in the way and the couple drifted apart. It's possible actually to do that with God as well. That our relationship with God, I don't think God ever moves away from us. I think what we do is we relationally drift from God because we get so busy and consumed with other things that we find ourselves far from God. And when God was once our first love in our lives, the priority of our lives, the first center of our lives, and now we find that where's God? I don't feel like God's with me anymore. I don't feel like God's anywhere near me anymore. I don't think that God's moved. I think we've relationally drifted from God. That's what happened in Ephesus. The people had been doing lots of great things, but they had drifted away from God. It's easy to do, isn't it? We all do that. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. We've all wandered. We've all relationally drifted away from God, and we know what that's like. So what do you do when that happens in a relationship, or particularly a relationship with God? How do you move back into relationship? Well, remember what we said. That's quadrant 2, right? And to do that, we have to be intentional about living in quadrant 2. We have to get real intentional about reinvesting ourselves in that relationship. Whatever relationship's been drifted, we've got to reinvest in it. When it comes to our relationship with God, we've got to spend time and reinvest in that relationship. One of the things, the reason the church exists is to help us reinvest, to help us be in relationship with God. We have lots of opportunities for us to do that. One way is simply, as we always encourage people, study our Bibles, pray, have daily devotions. That when we do that, we're being intentional. We're spending time in relationship with God. We're getting intentional. We're moving God back to first in our lives. That's why I always encourage that in the morning. I think the first thing in the morning to get up and to spend that time with God, because we're putting God first. We're putting our relationship with God first. So we do that in our daily devotions. We also encourage people to join a small group here. Because when we join a small group, we're studying together, we're learning together, and we're encouraging each other in our relationship with God. Other people who are wanting to be closer to God are with us, and we're encouraging each other and talking to one another in a way that encourages our faith and encourages us to strengthen our relationship with God. I know the Yom folks came back from Yom. I would encourage you to talk to one of them this morning. I often hear from these folks that go serve on a mission trip or even serve here locally with Habitat or with the Day One Center, that people come back and say, I took the time out. I invested the time to go do that, and I am so much more blessed. I feel so much closer to God as a result of spending the time doing those things, because it draws people closer to God and other people closer to God. And the other thing we can do, which we're doing right now, is go to worship. Attend worship. When we make that a part of our lives, a part of our routine, we're saying, God, you're going to be a part of my life. You're a first part of my life, and I'm going to be here regularly to put my relationship with you on foremost in my life. So we put God first when we do that on a regular basis. And when we do those things, we'll actually find that relational drift. We'll actually find ourselves growing closer and putting God back to a right place in our lives, to first place in our lives, to the center of our lives. So I want to wrap up just with this illustration this morning. Do we have any bikers in the house? I'm talking road cyclists. That's what I'm talking about. Anybody a cyclist? Not the motorized kind, but the kind that has wheels like this. Anybody ride those? Yeah, all right. So I took this off my bike that's gathering dust in my basement due to some knee problems, but I haven't been on this bike, so it's nice and clean now. I did clean it off a little bit. But the construction of this is very intentional. I want to use an illustration this morning. Does anybody here remember what the first wheel was made out of? Anybody around when the first wheel was made? Anybody still? Okay. What was it made out of? Just guess. Stone, right. Okay, so we assume stone. Now, can you imagine if I had a stone wheel this size on the front of my bike? Can you imagine that? I mean, I would go very little. I would not ride my bike ever. But what they did over the years, they designed this bike wheel, so that it's very light. And the way they did that was they created these spokes that actually can take a lot of strain but can't take a lot of stress. In fact, one of the things I can do is I can bend these with my bare hand this way, but they take the stress this way. And if this rim was by itself, I could actually bend it in half with my bare hands. So none of these components is very strong, the spokes or the rim on its own. And you can even get a flat tire. It's very easy to get a flat tire, even with Kevlar tires. So all these things in and of themselves alone are very weak. But when they're put together, they create strength, and the design of them helps them to withstand the outside stressors. Now, I haven't mentioned a part of this, but it's probably one of the most important parts of this wheel. Do you want to take a guess at what one of the most important parts of the wheel is? The center, right. Because this is where all the strength comes from, is this hub right here. Now, remember, and I said at the beginning of the sermon, I said there's not one thing, but there is a hinge point of which everything else needs to be connected. You know, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, all of it. And to put God at the center, the hub of our lives, that's where the strength comes from. If I move the hub over here, what happens? If it's not the center, right, what happens? This whole thing collapses. If I make this out of material that is not steel or strong, let's say I make it out of wood, what happens to it? It deteriorates. It breaks, right? A lot of self-improvement stuff out there, folks, says put yourself at the center. Make yourself the hub, and then just get yourself stronger. But what we've learned time and time again is we're frail, we're weak. And when we're weak, guess who's strong? If God's the center, God's strong. And without God at the center of our lives, without God being the hub of our lives, we actually are weaker. When the stresses of life hit us and start to compound on us, and our lives start to fall apart, it's sometimes because we've been depending on our own strength rather than God's strength. We haven't put God at the center of our lives. We haven't made God first in our lives. We haven't made God the first love of our lives. Now, the interesting thing is, God gives us that strength when God is there. But a mistake we sometimes make is we assume that God is just another spoke. We're at the center, and, our family, a friend, our relationship to God is just another spoke, our career, our job, our neighborhood, whatever it is. We assume God is a spoke when God says, make me the hub. Make me the center. Make me the first thing in your life. Not because God needs it. God doesn't need us to do that. God says, you, the way I designed you, the way I created you as a human being, you need me at the center of your life. I can give you the strength that you don't have. And that's why God calls us to that first love, to be first, have God first in our lives and in our relationships. Amen? Amen.